He was the highest-paid actor on network television, universally adored for his comedic charm and Hollywood royalty status. But behind the heavy gates of a sprawling Los Angeles estate, the script was terrifyingly different. A 6-month pregnant woman, clutching her infant daughter, is forced to flee a multi-million-dollar fortress in the dead of night. She wasn't running from a stalker or an intruder. She was escaping her own husband, a man who had transformed their family sanctuary into a heavily armed, drug-fueled brothel filled with high-priced escorts. How did the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale devolve into a lethal hostage situation, ending in a devastating HIV diagnosis and the total collapse of Charlie Sheen? Charlie Sheen was Hollywood royalty. As Martin Sheen's son, his on-screen magnetism fueled massive hits like Platoon and Wall Street. Yet, his talent was constantly overshadowed by severe chemical dependency and catastrophic legal troubles. When he successfully pivoted to network television on Spin City, the industry desperately needed to transition him from a tabloid liability into a stable commodity. They needed a stabilizing force. Enter Denise Richards. She had successfully navigated the transition from modeling to A-list cinema, cementing her status as a Bond girl in the world is not enough. Crucially, she projected grounded stability. Their June 2002 wedding was a cultural coronation. The media enthusiastically cast Richards as his savior, selling the patriarchal trope that a woman's devotion could cure long-standing addiction. For a brief period, the illusion held. They secured a sprawling California estate and welcomed their first daughter, Sam. But behind the heavy oak doors of their multi-million-dollar mansion, the narrative of the reformed prince was already silently buckling under the weight of an unacknowledged reality. Addiction rarely announces its return. Behind the heavy oak doors of their California estate, Sheen's relapse didn't start with a dramatic collapse. It began with sudden financial fluctuations, locked doors, and the metallic scent of paranoia. For Denise Richards, the collapse of her meticulously constructed reality did not happen overnight, but the timeline of the destruction was breathtakingly rapid. The public narrative still aggressively championed them as the ultimate Hollywood success story, a testament to the grounding power of family. The reality, however, was that the foundation of the marriage had already sustained critical, unrepairable fractures just 6 months after the birth of their first daughter. In the late months of 2004, Richards discovered she was pregnant with their second child, a daughter they would eventually name Lola. In a functioning, healthy domestic environment, this news would be a moment of profound celebration, the solidification of a growing dynasty. But the biology of a new pregnancy brings with it a severe, inescapable vulnerability. A woman in the early stages of gestation requires stability, physical safety, and psychological peace. Instead, Richards found herself physically compromised, exhausted by the demands of a newborn, and trapped in a sprawling estate that was rapidly mutating from a sanctuary into a highly volatile, completely unregulated danger zone. The man she had married, the allegedly reformed icon who had publicly credited her with saving his life, was systematically dismantling his own sobriety. Charlie Sheen's return to the abyss was not a momentary lapse. It was a catastrophic, full-throttle dive into the darkest iterations of his past. He did not merely slip, he actively courted destruction. The wealth generated by his massive television contracts acted as a limitless accelerant. Unlike an ordinary citizen whose addiction is eventually curtailed by financial ruin or logistical barriers, a Hollywood television star earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode possesses the capital to fund a completely insulated industrial-scale narcotic operation. He aggressively reintroduced severe chemical agents into his daily reality. The quiet routines of early fatherhood were violently replaced by the chaotic, unpredictable rhythms of heavy cocaine consumption, excessive quantities of hard liquor, and a highly dangerous cocktail of prescription medications. The physical transformation of the man within the house was terrifying. The charismatic, highly functional leading man the public saw on television was completely absent behind the gates of their Los Angeles estate. In his place was a man consumed by severe chemical paranoia, operating on sleep deprivation, his neurology entirely hijacked by the substances he was consuming. Living with a high-functioning addict of this magnitude requires the sober partner to navigate a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance. Richards was forced to become an involuntary warden in her own home. She was a mother trying to protect an infant and nurture a pregnancy, while simultaneously monitoring the erratic, increasingly dangerous behavior of a grown man who possessed absolute financial and territorial control over their environment. She attempted to intervene, utilizing the standard protocols of a desperate spouse. She pleaded, she reasoned, and she attempted to establish boundaries to protect the physical environment of their children. However, confronting an addict who wields immense power and absolute privilege rarely results in sudden clarity. It almost exclusively triggers a violent defensive backlash. When Richards attempted to address the relapse, the dynamic shifted from tragic to actively hostile. Sheen did not possess the capacity or the willingness to recognize his own dissent. Instead, the severe paranoia induced by the narcotics convinced him that his wife, the mother of his children, was the enemy. He viewed her attempts to enforce sobriety not as acts of love, but as direct threats to his autonomy and his access to the substances he fundamentally prioritized above his family. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly. The sprawling Los Angeles mansion, originally purchased and heavily fortified to keep the predatory gaze of the paparazzi out, became a trap that kept the terror firmly locked inside. The isolation of extreme wealth is a terrifying weapon. When a man commands a household staff, pays the security detail, and generates the entirety of the operational capital, he creates a vacuum where his authority cannot be challenged. Richards was effectively marooned. She could not call the police without instantly triggering a global media catastrophe that would permanently scar her children. She could not easily flee without navigating the complex, highly visible logistics of a celebrity separation. She was forced to endure the daily, grueling reality of a husband who was rapidly shedding his humanity. But the chemical dependency, as severe as it was, merely served as the catalyst for a much darker, infinitely more humiliating betrayal. An addict with limitless resources does not merely consume narcotics. They build an ecosystem to support their consumption. As Sheen's grip on reality fractured, his boundaries regarding the sanctity of his marital home completely dissolved. He was no longer satisfied with sneaking away to engage in his vices. He brought the Los Angeles underworld directly to their doorstep. He utilized his immense wealth to bypass the standard channels of infidelity. He was not engaging in a quiet affair with a co-star or a civilian. He actively sought out the highly transactional, entirely unregulated mechanics of the underground escort industry. While his wife was navigating the physical and emotional toll of a difficult pregnancy, struggling with nausea and exhaustion, the husband she had sworn to build a life with was actively contracting high-priced sex workers and adult film actresses, directing them past the security gates of their exclusive gated community. This was not a mistake born of momentary weakness. It was a calculated, logistical operation. He was utilizing the family estate, the very rooms they had decorated for their children, as a staging ground for supervised, narcotic-fueled excess. He was demanding that his pregnant wife coexist with a rotating cast of transient, highly paid women who were brought in explicitly to cater to the dark, violent impulses he could no longer suppress. The sanctuary of the marital home was completely eradicated, replaced by a terrifying, deeply humiliating reality where a globally celebrated actress was reduced to a hostage in a high-end brothel financed by her own husband. The anatomy of a celebrity scandal usually follows a predictable, almost comforting trajectory. The public is accustomed to the standard narrative of a hidden affair, the clandestine text messages, the hotel rendezvous, and the eventual tearful public apology. However, the highly structured brand of terror operating inside the Sheen residence during the late months of 2004 completely dismantled this conventional understanding of infidelity. The events transpiring behind the heavy security gates of their Los Angeles compound did not resemble a standard Hollywood affair in any capacity. There was no secrecy. There was no attempt to conceal the betrayal from a suspicious spouse. Instead, what materialized was the wholesale, aggressive importation of a highly lucrative, entirely unregulated criminal syndicate directly into the center of a marital home. Charlie Sheen had not merely broken his marriage vows. He had actively converted his family estate into a heavily financed, fully operational hub for the Los Angeles underground. According to subsequent legal filings, Sheen's return to the abyss was swift and fully funded. Bypassing standard infidelity, he directly cleared high-priced escorts and adult film stars past their gated security. He systematically funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into an underground procurement syndicate within a remarkably compressed time frame. The family estate, heavily fortified to keep paparazzi out, became a staging ground for multi-day narcotic-fueled parties. This staggering monetary figure was not the result of a singular weekend of poor judgment. It represented hundreds of distinct individual transactions. It represents a relentless daily logistical effort to acquire, transport, and consume human bodies. He was utilizing the massive wealth generated by his network television contracts to operate a privately funded, constantly rotating brothel within the exact same walls where his infant daughter slept and his wife navigated a high-risk pregnancy. The physical metamorphosis of the multi-million-dollar sanctuary was both rapid and horrifying. A home belonging to an A-list actress and a high-profile television star is typically managed with absolute militaristic precision. It is a strictly controlled environment, maintained by vetted domestic staff, where physical access is a highly restricted privilege reserved only for trusted intimates. Sheen completely obliterated this security perimeter. The sprawling living spaces, the custom-designed kitchens, and the heavily draped master suites were suddenly occupied by a relentless, unsupervised influx of strangers. High-priced sex workers and recognizable adult film actresses were routinely cleared through the neighborhood security gates, ordered directly by the master of the house. These were not brief, discreet encounters executed while the family was away. They were sprawling, multi-day endurance events fueled by staggering quantities of premium alcohol and heavy narcotics. The domestic tranquility was entirely shattered. The predictable, quiet rhythms of a household preparing for a new baby were violently replaced by the chaotic, unpredictable noise of strangers moving through the private corridors of the estate at all hours of the day and night. For the women being paid to be there, it was a highly lucrative, temporary assignment within the sprawling ecosystem of Los Angeles wealth. But for Denise Richards, it was a permanent, waking nightmare from which she was physically unable to escape. She was trapped inside the architecture of her own success, surrounded by the physical evidence of her husband's absolute moral collapse. The reality of her pregnancy made the psychological torture infinitely more acute. During the absolute peak of these sprawling, narcotic-fueled parties, Richards was 5 to 6 months pregnant with their second daughter, Lola. Instead of the environmental safety and rest required during her second trimester, Richards found herself trapped in a hostile environment. She was physically exhausted, heavily pregnant, and forced to step around the remnants of her husband's paid companions just to move from her bedroom to the nursery. The sheer audacity of Sheen's behavior was rooted in a terrifying, drug-induced megalomania. He made absolutely no effort to shield his pregnant wife from his activities. The traditional architecture of an affair relies on the perpetrator feeling a residual sense of shame, or at the very least, a desire to protect the primary partner from the devastating truth of the betrayal. Sheen possessed neither. He operated with the terrifying conviction that his immense wealth and his status as the primary financial provider granted him absolute, unquestionable immunity from the standard rules of human decency. He paraded his escorts through the house in broad daylight. He treated their presence not as a marital transgression, but as a standard, indisputable fixture of his newly reclaimed lifestyle. He was effectively daring his wife to challenge his authority within the domain he financed. However, the absolute nadir of this entire period, the specific, excruciating detail that elevates this narrative from a tragic addiction story into a portrait of pure, unadulterated psychological subjugation, occurred entirely outside the master bedroom. It happened in the kitchen. The dynamics of power in a profoundly abusive relationship are rarely about the physical act of violence alone. They are fundamentally about the systematic, deliberate destruction of the victim's dignity. Sheen required more than just the physical presence of the escorts. He required the total, humiliating submission of his wife to validate his dominance. As the parties raged in the private quarters of the house, leaving Sheen and his paid companions exhausted and requiring sustenance, he did not utilize his immense wealth to order his private chef to prepare food. He did not utilize the myriad of high-end, discreet catering options available to the Los Angeles elite. Instead, he explicitly commanded his heavily pregnant wife to serve them. Denise Richards, an international cinematic icon, a woman who had commanded millions of dollars to grace the screens of global blockbusters, was forced to stand in her own kitchen, physically encumbered by a 6-month pregnancy, and prepare meals for the sex workers occupying her husband's bed. She was instructed to assemble what were cruelly and specifically referred to as white trash sandwiches, cheap, mass-produced cold cuts and basic white bread, and physically serve them to the third persons who had been imported to dismantle her marriage. This act of forced servitude was not a logistical necessity. It was a highly calculated, devastating weapon of psychological annihilation. By forcing his wife to labor for the women he was paying for sex, Sheen was establishing a terrifying, undeniable hierarchy within the household. He was demonstrating, in the most visceral and humiliating manner possible, that her status as his legal wife, as an A-list actress, and as the mother of his unborn child offered her absolutely zero protection or respect. He was communicating that in his narcotic-fueled reality, she possessed less value and less authority than the transient escorts he purchased by the hour. It was the ultimate, inescapable exhibition of patriarchal dominance. He was not just breaking his vows, he was demanding that she actively, physically participate in the mechanics of her own degradation. When Richards attempted to push back against this staggering indignity, she did not encounter a man willing to negotiate, apologize, or recognize the profound cruelty of his actions. She encountered a predator whose neurology had been completely rewired by severe chemical dependency. Sheen's reaction to her visible distress was a chilling display of sociopathic normalization. He genuinely could not comprehend her outrage. In his altered state, surrounded by paid enablers and insulated entirely by his wealth, he viewed his behavior as an entirely acceptable, standard perk of his celebrity status. He explicitly framed his sprawling, multi-day orgies as simple, normal fun. He entirely dismissed the devastating emotional and psychological carnage he was inflicting upon his family, treating her trauma as an unreasonable overreaction to his perfectly justified entertainment. When her tears and desperate pleas failed to alter his trajectory, the dynamic shifted rapidly from dismissively cruel to actively dangerous. The moment Richards attempted to enforce basic domestic boundaries, to demand that the escorts leave the property, or to threaten to expose the reality of his relapse to the outside world, the mask of the charismatic television actor completely vanished. He weaponized his physical presence and his absolute financial authority, utilizing aggressive, highly specific threats to ensure her continued silent compliance. He made it violently clear that any attempt to disrupt his lifestyle, to cut off his access to the underworld, or to challenge his absolute rule over the household would not be tolerated. He was effectively holding her hostage in plain sight. She was a woman known to millions of people around the world, residing in one of the most visible, highly documented cities on the planet, yet she was entirely, profoundly isolated. She was trapped behind the heavy security gates of a mansion that had become a fortified prison, forced to silently endure the ultimate humiliation of serving the women who were destroying her life, paralyzed by the terrifying realization that the man she had married had completely surrendered his humanity to the darkest corners of his addiction. The transition from severe psychological humiliation to visceral, immediate physical terror is rarely a sudden explosion. It is usually a terrifying, gradual escalation. For Denise Richards, the nightmare operating within the walls of her Los Angeles estate did not stop at the forced servitude or the constant presence of high-priced escorts. As the winter of 2004 progressed, the sheer volume of narcotics being consumed by her husband began to fundamentally, irreversibly alter his neurochemistry. The sprawling mansion ceased to be merely a privately funded brothel. It rapidly mutated into a highly volatile, heavily armed compound ruled by a man experiencing severe, drug-induced psychosis. The paralyzing fear of this period was a direct result of his severe neurochemical shift. Subjected to massive, continuous quantities of cocaine and prescription drugs, his standard cognitive functions, empathy, rational judgment, and impulse control were entirely eradicated, replaced by an inescapable paranoia. Charlie Sheen was no longer simply an addict seeking a high. He was a man completely detached from the grounding tethers of reality, operating in a constant, terrifying state of hyperarousal. He began to perceive threats where none existed, viewing his own family, his domestic staff, and the outside world through the distorted, terrifying lens of his chemical dependency. This paranoia manifested in the most dangerous manner possible: the rapid, systematic militarization of the marital home. Sheen did not merely isolate himself, he began to heavily stockpile firearms. The presence of deadly weapons in any domestic environment inherently escalates the risk of tragedy, but introducing a massive arsenal into a household entirely controlled by a man suffering from severe narcotic psychosis is a recipe for absolute catastrophe. Richards was no longer just a pregnant woman dealing with a wayward husband. She was trapped in an enclosed space with a highly erratic, heavily intoxicated man who possessed immediate, unrestricted access to loaded guns. The physical geography of the multi-million-dollar estate transformed into a minefield. The heavy oak doors and state-of-the-art security systems that were designed to keep the predatory world out were now actively locking the lethal threat inside. Every sudden noise, every erratic footstep echoing down the hallway carried the implicit, terrifying threat of ballistic violence. However, the physical danger posed by the firearms was accompanied by a deeply disturbing, rapid decay of his internal moral architecture. Addiction is fundamentally a disease of boundary erosion, but Sheen's descent bypassed standard depravity and entered a realm of profound psychological darkness. As his grip on reality slipped, so too did any remaining semblance of his humanity. This total moral collapse was starkly evidenced by his digital footprint. Within the confines of their shared home, Richards made terrifying discoveries regarding the media he was actively consuming. He was not merely viewing standard, questionable content, he was deeply engaged with highly illicit, deeply disturbing, underground material. According to the subsequent, harrowing legal declarations filed by Richards, she discovered that his computer was routinely filled with extreme and strictly prohibited internet files, specifically citing content featuring the most severely restricted subjects and profoundly shocking dark web imagery. The discovery of this specific content was not merely a marital shock, it was a devastating psychological blow. It signaled a complete, irreversible fracturing of his moral compass. The man she had married, the man she had believed was a reformed, family-oriented partner, was actively utilizing the family computer to consume the darkest, most exploitative material available on the internet. For a mother actively gestating a new life and raising an infant daughter, the realization that her husband was mentally inhabiting these deeply depraved digital spaces was entirely paralyzing. It proved that his illness was not just a physical dependency, it was a profound sickness of the soul. As his internal world grew darker and more paranoid, his external behavior toward his wife escalated from dismissive neglect into direct, terrifying aggression. The tension within the household became utterly unsustainable. When Richards, driven by the desperate biological imperative to protect her unborn child and her infant daughter, attempted to confront him about the escalating danger, the response was violently physical. Sheen abandoned the psychological warfare and resorted to primitive intimidation. The legal documents detail multiple, terrifying instances where he physically assaulted her, forcefully shoving the woman who was carrying his second child. This physical violence was always accompanied by a barrage of aggressive, deeply profane verbal abuse. The language he utilized was not the standard, heated rhetoric of a failing marriage. It was the cold, calculated vocabulary of pure hatred. During these explosive, narcotic-fueled rages, he would corner her, utilizing his physical size and the terrifying unpredictability of his intoxication to completely dominate the space. In one particularly harrowing incident, meticulously documented in her 17-page legal declaration, he looked directly at his heavily pregnant wife and delivered a statement of absolute chilling cruelty. "I hope you f***ing die, bitch!" This was not a passing insult hurled during a fleeting argument. It was a cold, direct curse targeted at a deeply isolated woman who was actively carrying his own child. By explicitly wishing for her death, he was demonstrating a complete sociopathic detachment from the reality of their family. He was effectively communicating that she and the child she was carrying were entirely disposable, viewed merely as irritating obstacles interfering with his absolute right to consume narcotics and engage with the underground sex trade. The threats did not stop at cruel wishes. They rapidly evolved into explicit, calculated declarations of intent. Sheen began to actively weaponize the arsenal he had stockpiled, utilizing the implicit threat of lethal violence to ensure her total compliance. He made it abundantly clear that any attempt to disrupt his sprawling domestic brothel, any attempt to contact outside authorities, or any move to dismantle his highly protected lifestyle would result in her immediate execution. He threatened to kill her if she dared to stand in the way of his addiction. These were not empty theatrical threats. When a heavily intoxicated, severely paranoid man with a documented history of violence and a house full of loaded firearms tells you he is going to end your life, the threat is absolute reality. For Richards, the Los Angeles mansion became a genuine house of horrors. The fundamental human requirement for sleep became a terrifying vulnerability. She was completely unable to sleep in the master bedroom, entirely terrified of closing her eyes in the presence of a man who had explicitly promised to murder her. She was forced to spend her nights in a state of agonizing hypervigilance, barricading herself in the nursery with her infant daughter, listening to the chaotic, terrifying sounds of her husband's psychosis echoing through the massive estate. She was living in a constant state of adrenaline-fueled survival, enduring a level of psychological torture that is entirely incomprehensible to anyone who has not faced down a heavily armed, severely addicted predator in their own home. Yet, amidst the physical shoving, the death threats, and the loaded weapons, Sheen also deployed a highly sophisticated, deeply manipulative tactic of financial abuse, demonstrating that even in the depths of severe psychosis, the predatory instincts of the ultra-wealthy remain intact. He understood that physical violence leaves marks that can be utilized in a courtroom, but financial manipulation creates a complex, paralyzing web of control. This insidious strategy culminated in a bizarre, terrifying incident involving a massive sum of capital. The abuse was financial as well. In a chilling display of control, Sheen handed Richards a $1 million check, framing it as a birthday gift. It was a calculated trap to purchase her silence. When Richards refused to cash it, recognizing the danger, Sheen retaliated. He launched an aggressive lawsuit against his own pregnant wife over the uncashed gift, utilizing his elite legal team to exhaust her limited emotional reserves and force her to drain her own capital on legal defense during the most vulnerable months of her pregnancy. This entire sequence of events, the stockpiling of firearms, the consumption of depraved digital media, the physical assaults, the explicit death threats, and the weaponization of a $1 million check, paints a horrifying, clinically precise portrait of a man who had completely surrendered his soul. Charlie Sheen was no longer the charming actor the public celebrated. He was a highly dangerous, well-funded domestic terrorist operating with absolute impunity behind the gates of his Los Angeles fortress. He had effectively transformed a woman recognized globally as an icon of beauty and success into a terrified, hyper-vigilant hostage, fighting a desperate, agonizing battle simply to survive the night and protect the children trapped in the crossfire of his absolute destruction. There is a definitive, terrifying threshold in the cycle of domestic survival where the instinct to preserve the marriage is completely eclipsed by the primal, biological imperative to survive. For Denise Richards, this threshold was not crossed during a public argument or a highly visible Hollywood scandal. It was crossed in the suffocating, dangerous silence of her own home. Escaping a heavily fortified, multi-million-dollar celebrity compound is not a simple logistical maneuver. You do not simply pack a bag and walk out the front door. When the man you are fleeing possesses absolute financial control, commands a dedicated security staff, and operates in a state of severe paranoid narcotic psychosis, leaving becomes a highly calculated, high-risk hostage extraction. The physical act of her departure required immense, silent precision. She was forced to carefully navigate the sprawling geography of the Los Angeles estate, terrified of waking a man whose sleep patterns were entirely dictated by heavy chemical consumption. She was physically encumbered, deeply exhausted, and carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of a 6-month pregnancy. Every step toward the exit was a calculated risk. She had to gather her infant daughter, Sam, securing the child without triggering the motion sensors or alerting the domestic staff whose salaries were paid by her abuser. She abandoned the bespoke wardrobes, the luxury vehicles, and the sprawling real estate that the global public assumed constituted her perfect life. She traded the gilded cage for the terrifying uncertainty of the outside world, prioritizing the physical safety of her children over the immense insulating wealth of the Sheen dynasty. When the heavy security gates of the compound closed behind her, the physical danger temporarily subsided, but the institutional warfare was just beginning. In the entertainment industry, the dissolution of a high-profile marriage is traditionally handled with absolute clinical discretion. Elite legal syndicates are deployed to draft airtight non-disclosure agreements. Publicists meticulously craft joint statements utilizing sanitized, meaningless phrases like conscious uncoupling or amicable separation. The objective is always to protect the brand, to ensure that the lucrative earning potential of both parties remains uncontaminated by the messy human reality of the divorce. However, Denise Richards completely rejected this established Hollywood protocol. She recognized that standard public relations tactics were entirely useless against a man who had completely surrendered his humanity to addiction. She understood that playing the game of polite Hollywood discretion would only allow him to continue operating his subterranean world without consequence, leaving her and her children permanently vulnerable to his erratic retribution. Therefore, she did not rely on publicists. She relied on the American judicial system. In March of 2005, the facade of the perfect Hollywood marriage was formally and irrevocably detonated. Richards' legal team filed a petition for divorce in the Los Angeles Superior Court. The visual optics of this filing were inherently shocking. It is a profound, deeply unnatural sociological event to witness a woman, recognized globally for her beauty and success, filing to dissolve her marriage while visibly in the third trimester of her pregnancy. Society is conditioned to view a 6-month pregnancy as a period of ultimate domestic nesting, a time characterized by baby showers and glowing magazine profiles. For a woman to aggressively sever her legal ties to a wildly successful, immensely wealthy husband during this specific biological window sent a chilling, undeniable signal to the world. Whatever was happening behind the walls of that estate was severe enough to force a pregnant mother to embrace complete upheaval rather than endure another night in his presence. The initial filing cited the standard, legally sterile grounds of irreconcilable differences. This is the default terminology utilized in California family law, a bloodless phrase designed to initiate the bureaucratic process of separating assets. For a brief moment, the Hollywood establishment attempted to process the event as a standard, albeit tragic, celebrity split. But the machinery of Charlie Sheen's addiction did not halt simply because legal papers had been filed. His erratic behavior, his paranoia, and his aggressive attempts to control his fleeing wife rapidly escalated. Recognizing that a standard divorce proceeding would not provide the immediate physical protection she required to safely deliver her child, Richards and her legal counsel executed a devastating, highly aggressive legal strike. In April of 2006, after a brief, failed reconciliation attempt, Richards returned to the court to file for a temporary restraining order. Securing a restraining order against a deeply entrenched, immensely wealthy Hollywood actor is an incredibly difficult legal maneuver. The burden of proof is extraordinarily high. The judicial system requires overwhelming, undeniable evidence of immediate physical danger. To satisfy this legal threshold, Richards could not rely on vague accusations of unhappiness or infidelity. She was forced to systematically, clinically document the absolute darkest corners of her husband's psychosis. She submitted a sworn 17-page legal declaration under the strict penalty of perjury. This document was not a standard celebrity grievance. It was a forensic accounting of a man's total moral and psychological collapse. Court documents revealed that she painstakingly detailed the influx of high-priced escorts into the marital home. She documented the specific, staggering quantities of capital he was funneling into the underground sex trade. She outlined the severe, unpredictable nature of his narcotic consumption, painting a terrifying portrait of a man whose neurochemistry was completely unmoored from reality. She put the physical shoving, the aggressive intimidation, and the terrifying environment of the household onto the permanent, unalterable legal record. By executing this sworn declaration, Richards effectively cornered the legal system. She presented a narrative so heavily detailed, so overwhelmingly corroborated by the timeline of his erratic behavior, that the court had no choice but to intervene. The judge granted the temporary restraining order, handing down a legal mandate that fundamentally shattered Sheen's perception of absolute, untouchable power. The order legally compelled the highest-paid actor on network television to remain a minimum of 300 feet away from his wife and his children at all times. The psychological impact of this specific legal boundary cannot be overstated. For a man who had spent his entire adult life operating in an ecosystem that catered to his every whim, a man who believed his wealth allowed him to purchase any person or any experience, the restraining order was a profound, deeply humiliating neutralization. The state had formally stripped him of his authority. The Los Angeles Police Department was now legally mandated to arrest him if he dared to cross that 300-foot perimeter. His money, his famous lineage, and his television ratings were rendered completely useless against the sterile, uncompromising geometry of a court-ordered boundary. It was the ultimate, inescapable validation of Richard's terror. The judicial system had looked at the evidence and officially declared the reigning king of television to be a verified, lethal threat to his own family. In the era before the instantaneous, decentralized spread of social media, the containment of legal documents was slightly easier for high-powered Hollywood fixers. However, the sheer gravity and the explosive, deeply scandalous nature of Richard's 17-page declaration made containment entirely impossible. Within hours of the restraining order being granted, the heavily guarded vault of the Los Angeles Superior Court effectively sprang a massive leak. The documents bypassed the protective filters of the entertainment publicists and landed directly on the desks of the most aggressive tabloid and entertainment news syndicates on the planet. The detonation of this information across the global media landscape was catastrophic. The public, who had spent the last 3 years consuming the highly manufactured, heavily sanitized narrative of the reformed bad boy and his angelic wife, was suddenly violently confronted with the raw, unedited reality of the underground brothel he had been running. The leaked documents did not merely hint at misbehavior, they provided a granular, horrifyingly specific blueprint of his depravity. The public read about the escorts, they read about the drugs. They read the chilling descriptions of a pregnant woman navigating a heavily armed, severely toxic environment. The collision between Sheen's public persona and his newly exposed private reality created a massive, disorienting cultural shockwave. At the exact moment these documents leaked, Sheen was starring in the highly lucrative sitcom 2.5 Men. He was being paid millions of dollars to portray a lovable, charmingly dysfunctional bachelor. The television network had built a massive corporate infrastructure around his comedic timing and his roguish charm. The global audience was suddenly forced to reconcile the smiling, highly compensated actor on their television screens with the terrifying, violent predator described in the sworn legal testimony. For the Hollywood establishment, the leak was a crisis of unprecedented proportions. The industry is fundamentally built on the architecture of illusion, and Richard's declaration had completely obliterated the facade. The studio executives, the network presidents, and the highly paid public relations teams were paralyzed. They could not deploy the standard tactic of denying the allegations, because the allegations were not coming from an anonymous tabloid source. They were sworn into the legal record by a highly respected A-list actress under the penalty of perjury. They could not easily silence Richards, because she had already escaped his financial control and possessed the independent wealth and platform to defend herself. The courtroom detonation fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the separation. Charlie Sheen had spent months utilizing his wealth, his physical presence, and his terrifying paranoia to isolate and subjugate his wife. He had treated her as a disposable asset, convinced that his status as a Hollywood elite would eternally shield him from consequence. But by bravely executing a relentless, legally precise counteroffensive, Denise Richards had successfully inverted the paradigm. She took the darkest, most heavily guarded secrets of the Los Angeles underground and dragged them into the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent light of the judicial system. She sacrificed her own privacy, subjecting the most painful, humiliating details of her marriage to the ravenous scrutiny of the global public, all to secure the legal perimeter necessary to protect her children. The filing of the divorce and the securing of the restraining order were not acts of vengeance. They were acts of profound, calculated survival. She utilized the only weapon powerful enough to penetrate the armor of a billionaire addict, the absolute, unvarnished truth, codified into law. The explosion had leveled the multi-million-dollar illusion, leaving the disgraced actor standing alone in the wreckage, legally exiled from his family, while the woman he had attempted to destroy finally walked free from the blast radius. The detonation of the Richards-Sheen legal files in the spring of 2005 did not merely occupy a fleeting news cycle. It effectively hijacked the global cultural consciousness and fundamentally altered the sociological landscape of celebrity consumption. In the mid-2000s, the entertainment industry was navigating a profound and highly volatile transition. The traditional, heavily manicured gossip columns controlled by studio publicists were being aggressively replaced by a new, decentralized digital infrastructure pioneered by the early iterations of the blogosphere and relentless tabloid syndicates. This emerging media landscape thrived on the unvarnished, the unfiltered, and the catastrophic. When the 17-page sworn declaration from Denise Richards hit the public domain, bypassing all protective corporate filters, it became the defining artifact of this new era. The global audience was suddenly granted a front-row seat to a visceral, planetary spectacle of moral decay. For 3 years, the Hollywood marketing machine had successfully sold a highly profitable narrative of redemption, convincing the world that a radiant, grounded Bond girl had permanently cured a legendary bad boy. The revelation that the supposedly reformed Charlie Sheen was actually operating a drug-fueled, heavily armed domestic brothel, while his wife navigated a high-risk pregnancy, was experienced as a massive, collective cultural trauma. The public did not just witness a celebrity divorce, they witnessed the brutal, calculated execution of a modern fairy tale. The immediate reaction from the global tribunal was a potent mixture of profound shock and a cold, rising, fiercely protective outrage. The entertainment industry, which had spent millions of dollars promoting Sheen as a lovable, charmingly flawed father figure on network television, found itself in a state of absolute, terrified paralysis. However, the true force of the backlash originated from the audience, particularly the demographic of women who constituted the core viewership for both Richards' cinematic projects and Sheen's television sitcoms. These were women who possessed a deep, lived understanding of the grueling physical labor of motherhood, the absolute sanctity of the home, and the devastating, crushing weight of a husband's ultimate betrayal. To see a woman of Richards' international stature subjected to such profound, calculated indignity triggered a primal defensive reflex across the globe. The specific detail of her being forced to prepare white trash sandwiches for her husband's paid escorts became an undeniable symbol of his absolute cruelty. It was a detail so specific, so entirely unnecessary, and so viscerally humiliating that it bypassed intellectual analysis and struck directly at the heart of the public. It stripped away the last remaining lucrative fragments of Sheen's roguish charm, exposing a man who did not merely cheat, but who actively and systematically sought to dehumanize the pregnant woman who had legitimate, legal claims to his loyalty. As the horrifying details of the domestic terror within the Los Angeles estate continued to circulate, a profound and entirely unprecedented wave of solidarity began to form. This was not a standard celebrity fan base reaction. It was a massive, cross-cultural movement of women standing in a defensive formation around Denise Richards. In 2005, the mainstream vocabulary for domestic abuse and coercive control was significantly more limited than it is today, but the underlying predatory behavior was recognized instantly. The global community of women understood the terrifying calculus of trying to protect an infant and an unborn child from a heavily armed, severely addicted spouse. Public forums, radio call-in segments, and editorial pages were flooded with testimonials from individuals who saw their own silent traumas reflected in the Hollywood icon's desperate flight. This massive wall of public solidarity effectively and immediately neutralized the standard Hollywood public relations playbook. Historically, when a high-profile marriage collapsed due to a powerful man's depravity, the corporate machinery would ruthlessly attempt to shame the wife, questioning her temperament, her domestic skills, or her fundamental ability to satisfy her husband. Against Denise Richards, this misogynistic tactic failed catastrophically. The global public simply refused to accept any manufactured narrative that suggested a pregnant mother was responsible for her husband's descent into the violent, unregulated underworld. Recognizing that the sworn legal declaration was an existential threat to his multi-million-dollar network television career, Charlie Sheen's elite legal and public relations teams attempted to execute a desperate, highly aggressive counteroffensive. They utilized the historically effective strategy of character assassination, issuing rapid-fire statements characterizing Richards as unstable, vengeful, and purely motivated by financial greed. They aggressively attempted to frame the court-ordered restraining order not as a desperate, necessary protective measure, but as a calculated, cynical legal maneuver designed solely to extract a larger divorce settlement. However, the Sheen machinery fundamentally misunderstood the shifting cultural climate and the democratizing power of the leaked documents. The global public, empowered by the raw, unedited data of the court filings, was completely immune to these manufactured attacks. Every time Sheen's highly paid representatives labeled her unstable, the public pointed directly to the indisputable police records of his firearms and his well-documented drug-induced paranoia. Every time they called her greedy, the public highlighted the undeniable fact that she had willingly fled a life of absolute luxury with nothing but a suitcase to ensure the physical survival of her children. The corporate shame campaign did not destroy Denise Richards. It only served to further isolate and condemn Charlie Sheen, proving the exact point Richards had made in her legal filings. He was a man capable of extreme, unyielding cruelty toward the woman he had sworn to protect. This intense period of the scandal forced a broader, highly uncomfortable cultural conversation about the reality of domestic violence within the absolute highest echelons of society. It permanently shattered the deeply ingrained societal illusion that extreme fame and limitless capital could act as an impenetrable buffer against domestic terror. The public was forced to confront the chilling reality that a globally celebrated actress residing behind the heavy security gates of a Beverly Hills mansion could be just as vulnerable to physical intimidation, death threats, and severe psychological abuse as any ordinary citizen. By the time the initial firestorm began to settle into the long, grueling, and highly expensive process of litigation, Denise Richards had undergone a profound transformation in the eyes of the global audience. She was no longer defined simply by her status as a former fashion model or a cinematic sex symbol. She had been elevated to something much more significant and enduring: a survivor. The public watched with a mixture of awe and fierce protective affection as she navigated the third trimester of her pregnancy under the relentless, invasive scrutiny of the global press, maintaining an absolute, dignified silence. She refused to grant the Sheen syndicate the chaotic public meltdown they so desperately wanted to provoke. Her disciplined silence was recognized as a form of immense power, securing her position as the undisputed hero of her own narrative and setting the stage for the grueling 15-year legal and personal warfare that was about to commence. The divorce decree was merely the opening skirmish. Recognizing Sheen's limitless legal resources, Richards halted her peaking A-list career, trading red carpets for family court and reality television to fund her legal defense. While she retreated into protective motherhood, Sheen embarked on a highly visible descent, culminating in his 2011 termination from 2.5 men. But the bill for a decade of unchecked debauchery was eventually paid. In late 2015, Sheen confirmed he was HIV positive. The studios locked their gates, and his fortune hemorrhaged to settle lawsuits. 15 years later, the contrast is stark. Sheen lost his empire, serving as a permanent cautionary tale. Richards stands as the victor, saved not by her Hollywood status, but by her unyielding courage as a mother.